Did you know that using advanced vocabulary the wrong way can actually hurt your IELTS speaking score? Well, today we're going to talk about some of the ways that is true, and we're also going to talk about some ways to avoid that. So, if you don't remember, my name is Kevin. I'm a former IELTS examiner and current IELTS speaking teacher with about 10 years experience. And today I'm going to help you use vocabulary appropriately to boost your IELTS speaking score. So let's begin with a quick refresher on the IELTS scoring. Remember that vocabulary or lexical resource is worth 25% of your score, along with fluency and coherence, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. When we're talking about lexical resource or vocabulary, particularly at the higher bands, 7, 8, 9, the bands that I know you are trying to get, we're talking about using idiomatic phrases or words and vocabulary with awareness of style, with precision. What does that mean, precision? It means exactness. It means being able to get my meaning across in a very exact way, using the exact right word for the job. And I'll give you an example of how I hear people doing this the wrong way. Let's look at the word exhilarating. Exhilarating means very exciting. It's pretty much of a synonym, but we use it in very precise ways. If you come back and I ask you, how was your lunch? And you said, oh, my lunch was exhilarating. That doesn't really make sense to me. We simply wouldn't use exhilarating there. If I asked you how your run was or how your trip was, exhilarating? Okay, depending on the language you give me, the reasons you give me, yes, that is much more appropriate. But to say that you had an exhilarating lunch just really doesn't make sense. You are using the word imprecisely. Yes, it is an advanced vocabulary word, but if you're using it incorrectly, it doesn't matter. And let's talk about that. The difference between advanced vocabulary and precise vocabulary. Advanced are big words. Precise are exact words. A silly little example. If I say, ow, my head hurts, or I say, ow, my cranium hurts. Well, cranium is a more advanced word for head. Is it the same thing, though? It's not the same thing at all. If you said your cranium hurts, I would think you were crazy. If you said your head hurts, I get what you're trying to say. Advanced vocabulary is not always better. We're using the most precise word for the job. That's the important thing. So what are some ways that we can learn more precise vocabulary and that we can make sure we're learning them in the correct way? Well, you know I am a big fan of contextual learning. So I'm going to tell you, as an IELTS student, you should be reading lots of English material. You do not have to read difficult books. You just have to be reading a lot. You should be listening to a lot of English material. You should be watching a lot of English material. The more English you are bringing into your head, the more exposure you're going to have to different types of precise vocabulary, and more importantly, you're not going to be hearing just the words. You're going to be hearing them in context. You're going to be hearing them with collocations, with idiomatic phrases, with complete sentences around them. And that is going to help you learn when and how to use precise vocabulary. It's going to help you learn to say when to say my head hurts or my cranium hurts. There's a big difference there. And of course, I know that when you're reading, listening, and watching, you're not going to understand everything. I would encourage you to avoid looking up every single word that you don't know. That is not how you learned your first language. It's not efficient. A lot of times you can learn simply through context and how the characters are using the language. If you're building your own flashcards using something like Anki or Memrise, I would use complete sentences that are taken from a book, a movie, a podcast, or something else. I wouldn't be making my own sentences until I am 100% confident that I know how to use the precise words in the correct way. Otherwise, you could be teaching yourself something incorrect. As I've said before, there's a big difference between reading and receiving information and speaking or producing information. So that leads me to my next study tip, which is to shadow a native speaker. Where do we find native speakers? Well, I'm one. We have millions of them on YouTube. There are millions of them in other places on the internet, in podcasts and TV shows and movies. That is what you need to be doing. You're going to get double bonus of mirroring the precise vocabulary people are using, but also it's going to help your precision in your pronunciation, which is also very important. By mirroring things like intonation, any pronunciation errors you may have, my speech patterns, my stress patterns, it's going to make you sound more natural. I would also like to encourage you to remember that you have to start simple and then build up. Of course, it's very natural to use simpler words when you're starting English study or when you're first learning about a new topic. Over time, though, as you read more, as you watch more, as you listen more, your vocabulary will expand and you'll learn those more precise words, and more importantly, you will learn how to use them accurately. You are not going to start learning about a new topic and immediately know all the precise words. That comes over time. So please be patient with yourself. Don't expect to know everything right away. An English idiom is that you have to learn to walk before you can run. And the last point that I want to make is the one that I always hammer on, and that is that everything must be balanced with fluency. You are not going to get a good score if you're speaking very precisely, but it takes you forever to say a sentence. I would much rather you give a very fluid, fluent, natural sounding answer using simpler vocabulary than I would if you gave a very precise answer, but it took you forever to get it out. Think of it. If you're speaking your native language, what is more important? Being able to get your message across, or using the most precise, most advanced vocabulary? Of course, it's about getting your language across. And remember, the IELTS is a speaking exam. I want to test how well you communicate. And a lot of that is fluency and coherence. That is what I think is most important. It's the foundation that everything rests on. So don't sacrifice fluency to use the most precise vocabulary you can think of. You're going to hurt yourself. So, to summarize today's video, what do we need to remember about learning advanced vocabulary? First, learn words in context. Do not just study a list of vocabulary. You're not doing yourself any favors. Second, practice precision. That is through mirroring native speakers, through reading books perhaps that have both languages side by side, listening to a lot, reading a lot, watching a lot. You must practice. Third, do not sacrifice fluency and coherence to using the most precise language. If your precision is way up here, but your fluency is way down here, you're going to get a bad score. We need to be fluent first and then adding in those higher, more precise words. Remember, the IELTS exam is not about using the biggest words, the most advanced vocabulary that you can. It's about speaking and communicating clearly and confidently. If you follow these tips and you consistently practice, I know you will get the score that you're aiming for. And that brings us to the end. If you've learned any interesting or precise words that you're curious about or that you just want to share, leave them in the comments below. Leave any questions you have for me or comments about the video or comments about what you want to see me do in the future. As always, if this is helpful, give me a thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, happy studies.